Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. On Monday, just when US President Trump tweeted that China should not retaliate, the country announced new tariffs on $60 billion worth of US goods. As a result, the Dow Jones has performed its worst in 6 months, closing at 617 points or 2.4% lower. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq have also seen a decline. Now, let's take a look at this brief report to find out what trade relations between the two countries have been like historically and what are the latest developments.
Trade with China was banned by US until the early 1970s. After the full normalization of diplomatic and commercial relations in 1979, trade relations improved between the two countries. In October 2000, US President Bill Clinton signed the US-China Relations Act, granting Beijing permanent normal trade relations with the United States. This paved the way for the country to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. Between 1980 and 2004, US-China trade jumped from $5 billion to $231 billion. The U.S. trade deficit with China grew from $273.1 billion in 2010 to an all-time high of $295.5 billion in 2011. In March 2018, the Trump administration announced sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports worth at least $50 billion. It was a response to what the White House claimed is Chinese theft of U.S. technology and intellectual property. Fresh on the heels of tariffs on the import of steel and aluminium, the measures target goods including clothing, shoes and electronics and restrict some Chinese investment in the United States. China retaliated, and in early April, it imposed measures on a range of U.S. products, fueling fears of a trade war between the world's two largest economies. After multiple rounds of failed talks, the trade war has escalated to the point where each has slapped extra duties on trade worth over $360 billion in the last year. On Monday, China announced new tariffs on $60 billion of U.S. goods to come into effect on 1st of June. This step could cost the U.S. roughly 1 million jobs. It has already provoked groans in Wall Street, with the Dow Jones dropping as much as 707 points. Trump's economic advisor Larry Kudlow has already warned both sides would suffer.
We want to be as sure as we can be. We don't think the Chinese have come far enough. We'll wait and see. The talks will continue, and I will say this, there's a G20 meeting in Japan toward the end of June next month. The chances that President Trump and President Xi will get together at that meeting are probably pretty good.
On the other hand, Chinese experts feel that the hike in tariffs would only damage the U.S. economy.
In the short term, China and the U.S. will share the cost of the tariffs.
To some, the trade war between U.S. and China may not be of much importance, but experts and White House's economic advisor agree that if prolonged, both sides will suffer in this trade war.
To discuss where both countries are headed now and who is affected most by these new tariffs, let me welcome our guests. We have with us Mr. Joaquin Flores from Serbia. He is the director of the Center for Syncretic Studies and the editor-in-chief of Fortrust News. And also from Beijing, we are joined by Mr. Einar Tangen, a political and economic commentator. Welcome to Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Einar. Let me start with the basic question. Were you surprised by China's move, or was it completely expected?
It was completely expected and actually quite muted, given different things that they could have done. I think China has figured out that the greatest damage to the U.S. is actually being done by Donald Trump himself. It's going to be, according to Goldman Sachs, according to Bank of America, and all of the economists out there, and even one of President Trump's key aides, they know that this will be paid by the American public and consumers.
Mr. Flores, do you think this goes by what Trump is notoriously known for in how he cuts a deal, that right at the last minute he throws a fit and tries to catch his opponents off guard?
Absolutely. I think that you've got it there. Keep in mind also that we're approaching election season, so that means that it wouldn't be the most prudent to come to any deal at the present time, which his opponents and critics could possibly poke any holes in at all. whatsoever. And so he's probably looking at trying to kick this ball down the field a bit and wait until after the election, gambling on a re-election, and then maybe looking at solving this perhaps somewhat imaginary U.S.-China trade crisis.
Why do you say somewhat imaginary trade crisis?
Well, the United States has had a long-time trade partnership with China, and China and the United States have conducted very fruitful interactions for the last number of decades, going past 40 years now. And I think that, of course, there's a new narrative that the Trump administration, contrary to some other people in his party, and as well, of course, in the Democratic Party, are looking to change the narrative into an anti-China narrative. But they're really looking at shaping a long-term ideological discourse moving forward to the next 10 and 20 years. And so these little steps we see right now are really less than, let's say, transparent. Because in the long run, Chinese economy is expected to surpass the American economy, and the United States, of course, its political class needs to save face. Mm-hmm. So that's why there's a lot of imagination going on. But I think they've been quite creative in at least creating the specter of a deeper crisis than it really is. And as our other guest has commented, China's response has really been quite muted.
Right. And Mr. Ayza, would you agree with this? Seems to be a sort of a distraction created by the U.S. as they realize that it will be a lot of face saving needed for them in the end, seeing how China is progressing.
Well, actually, I agree with Professor Flores on his long-term analysis of this. This is, in fact, becoming more ideological. American exceptionalism and the ideas of the last man standing and the end of the world, this thing that everything will be a one-size-fits-all in terms of democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. Obviously, China has a different view of that. In terms of the short term, though, I don't know that this is going to do Donald Trump any good. He's looking at an election where he does not have a lot of good economic news. The last strength that was shown by the last reports have indicated that, yes, everything looks good on the surface. But when you start probing below it, manufacturing is down and so is consumer sentiment. This is going to drive it down even further. The last thing you want to do is going into election, have people going into Christmas not being able to buy toys, not being able to afford the things that they could afford last year. They will remember that, as are the farmers who are now bitterly complaining and marshaling their representatives to start doing something very serious about this. These people are not, figments of imagination. They're not figures on a spreadsheet. They're real people who are going to lose their farms. Right. And this is not something that they take very lightly.
And it's also strange that how President Trump seemed almost unfazed, considering that after this announcement came on Monday that China will slap on tariffs on U.S. goods, that the stock market started to decline. I mean, obviously, there is a lot of money lost here, business opportunities lost here. Mr. Flores, do you feel that this also is a disconnect from what President Trump what he believes and what the U.S. economy, where it stands?
The endemic problems within the U.S. economy stem back quite a number of decades. It has to do with the deindustrialization, the outsourcing of productive jobs overseas. But in order to be a successful politician, one has to unite the country around a foreign opponent. And so while all of this has been the doing of American politicians, and I think that at the same on one level, and agreeing with our guest as well, that voters will keep this in mind, this economic problem. This is one that people have had for quite a number of decades and really isn't a new problem. And if we look at issues that affect American consumers, are more related to interest rates and credits and less to the position of the stock market. Now, when we look at the particular question of volume trading, this can be manipulated. And so I think that what this is really a sign is that many companies which deal in volume trading and which can manipulate the stock market overnight and can somewhat match reports on the movement of stock indexes to political moves is somewhat holographic and not exactly how reality works on the ground. So we have to bear in mind that there are many businesses that are opposed to this and they're really punishing him by doing this. But it's not the same thing as realigning the American economy and accusing China of maintaining a deflated currency or suppressed value currency, as we see in the United States, which has also mirrored that policy extensively through its own inflationary policy. So it's a lot of calling the pot calling the kettle black with American policy. And really, Trump has invented a crisis in order to solve it. And it's really meant as a distraction from America's own internal problems, and which are related, of course, to its speculative-based economy over the long term.
Absolutely. And it's a good point raised there, especially the point about calling the kettle black. I mean, it is essentially, it started off as the intellectual rights, the whole debate over that the policies that China follows in trade is not fair. It's not as a U.S. would do it. I mean, that could have taken a very different route, essentially, if it hadn't a different agenda, Mr. Ayna, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, in the past, what happened is the United States would band together with, the European Union, other states that felt strongly about this, Japan, South Korea, basically the first world countries, and they would try to exert pressure, both illegally through the WTO. Remember that the United States has been successful in about 78% of the cases they brought. So far from being ineffective, the WTO has sided most often with the U.S. And then politically, by saying that China needs to be more in sync with international standards. Now, ironically, what has happened now is that China has switched gears, and they're now very forcibly pursuing intellectual property rights. Part of that is because China is now the largest intellectual property registrant in the world in terms of countries. And as a result of that, they're more interested in making sure that the intellectual property and the innovation that they want to encourage go forward. But just, I want to go back to a point that my esteemed colleague made. I said, let's put it in simple terms. Jobs are very simple. In the U.S., it's $15 an hour. $15 will get you a day's worth of labor in China. It'll get you a week's worth of labor if you're in Vietnam. So, the idea that these jobs are going to be flowing back, these assembly jobs and things like that are going to be flowing back to the United States, or whether it's retail or footwear, is just kind of silly. You couldn't pay somebody that legally. So how would that be possible? So, I mean, this is a manufactured crisis. Unfortunately, I think Donald Trump has overplayed his hand. And at this juncture, he's actually threatening the world, not just China, because this idea of creating vassal states and dictating to different countries what their economic and political system should be is, I think, antithetical. It reminds me of the movie The Hunger Games.
Right, but it's also playing well to the narrative that he hopes to portray to his voters to galvanize their vote, doesn't it, Mr. Flores? I mean, do you feel that it could be working in his favor, or this disconnect, for example, how he thinks that not the U.S. consumer, but the Chinese are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of these tariffs, this extra cost, these new taxes?
So working people and middle-class people in the United States will always bear the brunt of the economic malfeasance of the American elites. And this is a standard rule in how American society functions. And this is not going to change under Trump or under anyone else in the foreseeable future. But a point I think that needs to be made is that in terms of making America competitive with the rest of the world, the primary issue is really looking at the inflated value of real estate in the United States. And once that issue can be tackled, and of course, Trump, as a real estate mogul, understands real estate more than anyone. And I think that one of the things that we can be looking at going into the second term and galvanizing the public and stoking public support and really attacking the Democrats, because it was Obama who followed through with Bush's bailout and the quantitative easing program, which really alleviated banks to the demise of American people, so to speak. So following this populist rhetoric, I think what we can see are more promises that probably will never be fulfilled, but at the same time are important promises to make. And unfortunately, the American voter has been conditioned for so long to believe in promises, and their memory is very short. And so I think that in a very cynical and perhaps even Machiavellian way, Trump administration campaign experts understand this. And so they're going to be looking at attacking the banks who hold mortgages and have many properties that are not on market, and he's going to be saying, well, these now need to be put on market, that this will further decrease the value of housing, and it's the cost of housing and the associated cost of rents for businesses which are inflating the cost of the value of the dollar. And so then suddenly, if he can make that argument, I'm not saying that he can make this a reality, but if he can make that argument that this promise is possible, then he can regain support, because there's a certain logic to that idea that you can reduce the value of properties, and then you can also reduce the international value of the dollar without changing the nominal numerical number in the United States. So Americans won't perceive that they're earning less, even though their dollar is worth less. And if their rents were lower, then their wages would actually be lower and be competitive on a global level.
Yes, and Mr. Ayna, do you feel that the same note after China announced its plan of raising tariffs, when President Trump continuously says that China was retaliating against U.S. farmers whom he would allocate funds to help? Is this the same sort of kind of different world he's living in that doesn't relate to reality at all?
No, I mean, Donald Trump is a savant when it comes to manipulating the public. He schooled himself very well, first under the lawyer who was under the McCarthy hearings. This is the anti-communist things. This is a guy named Roy Cohn, who he's admitted was his mentor, and also through his reality show. He looks at the stats very, very carefully. As we know, he watches TV more than he reads reports. So he understands how this goes, but he's running out of runway. The fact is, he has to deliver. And if we go into, as I said, into a Christmas time, and people find that they cannot buy toys for their children, they cannot afford the things that they had before, they remember that. Now, in almost all cases, these elections are decided by people reaching into their pockets and deciding whether there's more or less money than the last time that they checked at the last election. So in Donald Trump's case, he needs some positive economic news. $2 trillion has disappeared from the world bourses. More could come.
So, Mr. Flores, have trade tariffs ever worked? I mean, can we look back in history? Can we look at what Obama did during his time when he imposed tariffs on tires? I mean, has there been any kind of positive spin to putting trade tariffs?
There is a history of tariffs working, not under the Obama administration, but one would have to look past over perhaps 100 years ago to see an effective tariff implementation. So you would be looking at administrations long past. But we live in a new economic paradigm, and many have called it a post-Keynesian paradigm. And I think that when we look at really Trump's viability and his political clout, China is not his only issue. So we have to sort of disconnect the future of U.S.-China trade relations and trade talks and moving past this impasse and his credibility as a candidate in the coming elections, because he has Christian Zionists, he has conservatives, populists. He has people, of course, who are looking at this question of manufacturing, but that's only one segment of his base. And there are many other things to attack his opponents on, and there are many distractions that can be laid out. And I think, as Mr. Einar has so articulately and beautifully spelled out for us, he's a master manipulator and completely understands the American mindset. And I don't think that the American mindset is strictly economic in its viewpoint. I think that the level of destitution in the United States has already reached such unprecedented levels, and the unemployment has already reached such high levels, unprecedented in the past, in real terms, in terms of the hours that people work and the real dollars that people make, that people are not looking at this Christmas as a definitive Christmas that's going to determine whether Trump has their vote or not. It's going to be how convincing his promises are.
Right. Thank you so much there, Boris, for your input. Now, Mr. Einar, if we are to also take a wider look at this, besides whether they have worked or not, clearly having worked 100 years ago don't resonate with the globalized sort of economy that we have in today's world. But who is losing out more? Is it the US or China? Or is the global economy at large the one who is facing the biggest fall from this?
Well, if I was to rank them, I would say it's probably first the U.S. consumers. I would agree with my colleague on that. The second, I would put the world. because this is hitting countries that are in essence defenseless at this point. They don't have the kind of strength and power. I mean, remember, the whole basis of what Donald Trump says is that the richest, economically, politically, and militarily powerful nation has somehow been a massive victim of the last 30 years, despite having taken the lion's share of 2/3 of the world's profits and seeing its 90% of its people actually take a 0.4% decrease in the amount of their real property. China, I think, is the last. I think they actually have the toolbox in order to do what's necessary to keep their economy afloat. Remember, about 78% of their economy is now internally focused. 15% is on these exports, and the U.S. is only a portion of that. Will it hurt? Will companies go out of business? Absolutely. But the first tranche of tariffs was actually much more destructive to China. The second tranche, I don't think, is going to be as destructive because they've retooled. And it's part of the reason that they're not willing to accept the dictates of Washington. And this idea that somehow, while you're negotiating, you have made promises before you reach an agreement is kind of strange. Right. I'm a lawyer. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I've said, oh, you made promises during the negotiation, and therefore you have to keep them. The negotiation is about an all parts equal, right, and both sides agreeing.